Excellent. Very cool. Okay, so if you guys have witnessed our last few tries, we're getting used to the Facebook Live and how they always change things up. So we're going to do this in a little different way than how you typically might see an interview. Jessica works, she's our digital marketing coordinator, and she does a fabulous job. Everything you see on Facebook and Instagram, she does. So she's going to type in some questions for me in the comment box, and I will be answering those. But feel free to, if you guys have questions, type them in there. I would love to answer. This is to help you and your churches and your context. So yeah, the more we can do that, the better this will be, I think. A little bit about me. I'm the director of church engagement here at Team. I've been with Team for almost 6 years now. I love working with Team. I love our vision for helping churches send missionaries. And I love my role is really getting to figure out how do we do that practically. So it's a really great thing to say that we help churches send missionaries, but how do we actually help you send missionaries? So that's really my goal. We've got a team of 4 people that are across the country as church engagement managers. And our whole role is to just figure out how do we help churches go deeper in missions and send more missionaries. So that's what my role is. And I do that, like I said, from Denton, Texas. So it's great to see you guys. Thanks for taking the time out this morning to join us. So I guess I could share a little bit, Jessica, as you kind of type in some questions there. We have a blog post that went live today, which is how to become a sending church. I would say in my role with church engagement, we have seen, so many churches come through and say we want to engage in missions, but we're not really sure how to do that or what that really means. So understanding that the churches understand that God has called them to be a part of missions in some way, but just what are the steps to doing that? So at Team here, we all of our missionaries have a sending church. And so we've got over 300 sending churches that some send one missionary, some send multiple. It's cool because we work with churches that are small and maybe in very rural areas, or really large churches that have multiple campuses and everything in between. Every church relationship is so unique, and what God is calling your church to do is unique. And so our role at Team is to figure out what applies, like how can you and your congregation, your people engage in missions. But looking at our over 300 sending churches, there were a few characteristics that started to come up. So we saw that churches that send people out locally and globally across the world as missionaries tend to have 4 common characteristics. And so you'll see on Team's blog today, we kind of go into that a little bit. But this is the backbone of all of our work we do at church engagement at Team, is these 4 steps. So the first way we see churches engage in missions and become a church that sends is through prayer. Now you may be like, okay, great, Sunday school answer. Thank you for sharing that with me. But we see that prayer, whenever we start centering our hearts on what the Lord has called us to do, on his desires for the nations to know his name and know the gospel and share it, that begins to change hearts in your congregation. And so prayer is the very first step. Praying for the nations, praying for missionaries, praying for God to show your church what he's calling you to do. That's the first step to become a church that sends. And the second step we see is discipleship. And so we see that churches that send, discipleship doesn't end with conversion. It ends with disciples who are making other disciples, whether that is across the street or around the world. So discipling to have a heart for the nations is something that really comes from the local church. And as you dig into scripture and see God's heart over and over again to bless the nations with his name and with his news, that's what we see. So churches that disciple their people beyond conversion to have a heart for the nations, that's a church that sends. And the third characteristic we see is preparation. So this is actually maybe one of my favorite steps and kind of our sweet spot, I think, to work with churches here at Team is preparation. It's not the most flashy one. It's not the most marketable one or whatever, but a church that sends has policies and systems in place to send missionaries well and to care for them well. So that means that no one's falling through the cracks. You know what to do when someone comes up and says, hey, I'm feeling called to missions. And that is a huge thing. that instead of scrambling to come up with something new, or maybe making that person feel like, oh, that's the weirdest thing I've ever heard, that you're called to missions, that you have a process in place, whether that is just meeting with a pastor or whether that's a whole discipleship program for them to go through. So preparation, you can tell by how excited I get that one's my favorite. The fourth step in becoming a church that sends is communication. So after you send people out, or as you are casting a vision to send people out as missionaries, how can you communicate that to your congregation? How are you sharing prayer requests? How are you sharing that there's a need for missionaries? If you have missionaries on the field and they need, maybe a nanny to come help take care of their kiddos, are you communicating that need with your church? And then are you celebrating what God's doing? Celebration is a huge part of our faith that I think sometimes we forget because there's so much work to do, but celebrating what God is doing. So those are the 4 steps. I'm really excited to kind of dive in a little bit deeper here into those. So if you got questions, again, just put them in the chat box. I'd love to answer them. I see we've got one from Jessica. She said, what is a sending church? That is a good question, because all of this doesn't matter if you don't know what a sending church is. All of our missionaries at Team have a sending church, whether they're going short-term for a few weeks or whether they're going for the rest of their life. And a sending church is the church that kind of stands behind that missionary or that missionary couple and says, yes, we have seen how God has called them in their life. We have seen that they are passionate about the Lord and that they are ready to share that with other people in a cross-cultural context. A sending church is someone that agrees to support that person emotionally. A lot of times it's financially as well. And that sending church helps Team assess that person, because you see them at church week in and week out. You get to see sides of them as they serve and minister and live in community that as the agency we don't always get to see. And so a sending church helps assess that person and then also offers great care for that missionary when they're overseas. So Team, we have a top-notch member care department. I love it. But as one of our missionaries one time said, sometimes you just need Grandma Betty to eat a casserole with you at the counter and talk about missions. And that is where the church comes in with member care, is that casserole care. So that is, in a little nutshell, what a sending church is. The next question, why would churches want to send missionaries? I think that is such a great question. Whenever we look at kind of the whole narrative of Scripture, we see over and over again that God called Abraham and called the nation of Israel to be blessed so that they can show the nations that God is the Lord. And so we see that over and over again in the Old Testament. And then in the New Testament, we see Jesus fulfilling that promise, becoming the ultimate blessing, and him empowering and commissioning the church to go out and share the gospel among the nations. So I think the question isn't necessarily why do we want to send missionaries. I think missionaries is a huge part of fulfilling that Great Commission. So our main desire isn't to send missionaries, but our main desire is to see the nations know who Jesus is and know his name, to have Scripture in their heart language. That's the goal, and missionaries are a huge part of that, because there are still so many places without even one believer or one healthy church that's there. And so by sending people who are discipled, who know Jesus, who want to share that with other people, and sending them to a place without that there, that's why missionaries are needed. And that's one huge way churches can engage in the Great Commission. Good question. So Jessica says, how can churches specifically and boldly pray about their mission strategy? Oh, that gets me fired up. I think, so I think a lot of times prayer starts with, opening up a website like Joshua Project, which has some really great prayer resources, and just praying for the people group that comes up. Or praying for, maybe there's a place where a lot of people in your congregation have traveled to. Maybe start for praying for that nation and finding out the needs there. I think to pray boldly and specifically about your mission strategy, I think it's praying, God, I know you've called us to do something. What are you specifically calling our church to do? And I think you can kind of take inventory of that. What ministries do people at your church get really excited about? Who are the people groups around your local church, and how are you engaging them, or how would you like to engage them? Really just praying that God opens your eyes to what you're already doing or what you already could be doing locally, and then spreading that across the world. So we have some churches that there are people groups that are in their area. And so they have a specific local missions focus that they want to work with. Vulnerable women is one of them, and then Southeast Asians is the other people group. And so they've done that locally, and so that actually extended to their international missions focus as well. So they're like, oh, so we know we can do this locally, so we want to learn how to do that better, and we also want to do it in places where there are less churches. And so their main focus in sending missionaries is to serve vulnerable women and Southeast Asians. So your local and global missions focus can be tied very closely together, and I would just pray for God to open up your eyes to what you're already doing or what you could be doing. Yeah, Jessica shared the link to the Joshua Project website, which, if your church doesn't have rhythms of prayer for missions, I would recommend, maybe just have a 15-minute meeting in between services or in between Sunday school and your main service, where anyone that's interested can come and just pray for a people group of the month and just pray and see what God does. That's a great place to start. Hi, Ben. So Ben says, can you comment on any trends you might be noticing in churches shifting their support to missions organizations versus individual missionaries and what the impact of this shift might be? Oh, that is an interesting question. I love looking at trends of what churches are looking to support. I will say here at Team, we still see the individual missionary as the main supporter. I think some churches that have maybe sent missionaries for a long time are kind of shifting to how do they start influencing other churches or make a bigger impact among the people group. I will say maybe my favorite trend here that we're seeing is instead of just supporting a missionary and not really knowing / not really caring, I hate to say that, not really knowing the people group or the people that they're there to serve, we're seeing more churches have a broader view of missions. So instead of just that one couple or that one person who's going overseas, they really want to know the whole ministry area and what's happening with that whole people group and supporting that as a whole. And I think that's a win. I think that's a win for the missionary. I think that's a win for the ministry area. As Steve Burns says in one of my favorite church missions books, Well Sent, he says, to care well for the missionary, you have to care for the worker and the work. They're dedicating their life to this work, guys. We have to care about it so we can care about the same things they care about. Oh yeah, Doug shared Operation World. That's also a really great resource for prayer. We've seen there's one church, it's actually a recent church plant that's sending their first missionary out. They've been so fun to work with, and they're so passionate. So even as these people have gone through the application process, before they're even fundraising, every week they have a prayer meeting to pray for the people group that these people feel called to. So even though they don't have, a firm connection yet to that people group, they don't have anyone on the ground, they're already taking steps to pray, which I think is awesome. Jessica said the second characteristic is discipleship. How can you talk a little bit more about that and what does that look like in practice? You could get me going a little bit on this. I think in practice, what this looks like is not just conversion being the end goal, which we celebrate that. We celebrate people coming to know the Lord. That is not a bad thing at all. We celebrate that, but also saying as we continue to grow in our knowledge of Jesus, we have been saved to share that with other people. And so all believers in your church, whether that is someone who is always going to stay in the same city, or whether that's someone that's going to move across the world, they've been saved so that they can share the gospel with other people. And so just having that as the mindset and the backbone of all discipleship at your church, I think is so important. So, your small groups are talking about how they can be a blessing in the community. And it's not just, the end goal is to bring people to church, but to really go out from the church and to share the gospel with people outside of the walls. How we at Team try to help with that is we've got a 6-session workshop that is just, I love it so much, written by our Learning and Development Department called Explore. And what it is 6 sessions where you just go through scripture and you learn God's heart for the nations, and you learn how does that apply to you when you're going to the grocery store and choosing to go through the self-checkout lane or through a cashier's lane. Or how does that apply to you if you are starting to feel a call to missions, but you really have no idea what that means? So Explore is a great workshop. We've got people that can facilitate it all across the nation. So yeah, that's one of the biggest ways we've seen that happen. Good question about mission strategy. What is a mission strategy and what does it mean to have one? I think that vision is so important in a church. It's so important to have a vision for discipleship, a vision for fellowship and how people are going to come together, and a vision for evangelism and missions. And so I think in general, it's very easy to say missions is a good thing and all missions things are good things. And I wouldn't disagree with that. But I do think having a vision for what God is calling your church to do casts a vision in individual hearts. So instead of saying, if you might be called somewhere in the world to do something, maybe talk to someone. Or you could say, hey, our church is very invested in Southeast Asia, and here are the specific ways that we want to invest there. What is your role? Just casting a vision like that helps people see their role in engaging in that vision more than just, the nebulous, scary word of missions. We see people do mission strategies a lot of different ways. At Team, we kind of talk about our opportunities in 3 ways. It's how you serve, who you serve, and where you serve. And so some people decide to take that where you serve and to have a geographical approach. Maybe they have a few countries or a region of the world that they've adopted, and that is their mission strategy. Is they want to send people there and make a very deep impact in that place. Some churches go with how you serve. They specifically want to send church planters, or maybe there are a lot of teachers at their church, so they really support education. And that just really fits the personality of the church and who God's called that church to be. Some churches are really passionate about maybe soul care and counseling, so that would be a big part of their mission strategy, that how you serve. And then other people do who you serve. So maybe your church is in a place where there's a large Buddhist population. As you guys serve locally, that Buddhist population, you learn about their culture. You're also looking to send people internationally to Buddhist cultures. So that who you serve, kind of the people group or maybe region. That's just a few ways to do it. I don't think there's necessarily a wrong way, but I think always being open to what God's calling your church to do, while just trying to cast a specific vision so people can see their role, whether they're sitting in the pew or whether they're moving around the country or across the world. Something about mission strategies is we've got a resource that you can download for free. It's called Casting a Vision for Missions, and it is at team.org/churches. And what it is a 6-step process for your church to determine what God is calling you to do and what missions partnerships he might be calling you to pursue. And whether you do that through Team or through another organization or through people at your church, our church engagement managers would love to talk with your missions committee or missions team about that. And the last characteristic that we see is communication. So Jessica asks, who needs to communicate and who is responsible for initiating and facilitating communication? Oh, that's good. I think everyone. Everyone is responsible for facilitating that communication. I think at the church level, it's really good to have a policy and a strategy for how communication happens normally. A good rule of thumb is how often you want to hear from your missionary is how often they should hear from you. So if you are requiring a monthly newsletter to be sent to your church, make sure someone's replying to that newsletter every month, because it's not a one-way street. You want to keep a relationship going, and so that means you should reply to that, or you should ask them questions. I think a lot of times looking at their small group or their Bible study group that they were at, even previously before going overseas, is a good place, because those are the people that have maybe been closest with them at the church. Looking for that small group and maybe resourcing them as a church to ask questions, maybe have a Skype call with them every other month, and then just checking in as the church staff or as the missions team to say, hey, how's that going? How's that person doing? So I think that's kind of the church's role. I think as the agency, we've got a day-to-day role as to have great leaders and great oversight, so that the missionaries aren't feeling alone and they've got great member care. And I think the missionary gets the joy of part of their ministry is sharing what God is doing around the world. So those kind of three things, we call it the sending triangle. That's not unique to team, but the church and the agency and the missionary all working together to communicate well. Something I think we talk about a lot is the church and missionary talking and the agency and the missionary talking, but not as much about the agency and the church talking. I think that's so important. If you want to care for your missionaries well, the agency needs to know what the church is doing, the church needs to know what the agency is doing, and we can all work together to make sure that that missionary is being well taken care of and hitting all their goals and fulfilling really what God has called the church to do through that missionary. What if you do all the steps and still no one speaks up about having a call to missions? Is there a healthy way to identify specific individuals who might make good missionaries and encourage them to go? That is a great question. Well, first, I don't think you can go through the 4 steps consistently at your church and not have anyone speak up and feel like they want to go. Maybe I'm just thinking very highly about this process, but yeah, I think there is a healthy way to identify individuals, like really looking at who, listening to who's really responding to this, asking really good questions about a heart for the nations, who loves to travel, maybe whose job is already taking them overseas. Maybe you've got a military community in your area, or maybe you've got a lot of businessmen who travel, businessmen and women, maybe thinking through how do you incorporate that into your mission strategy. It doesn't always have to look one way, because remember, the goal is not necessarily to send missionaries, but the goal is to send out all believers to share the gospel. So it doesn't have to look one way. There are a lot of different ways. Some ways I've seen churches do this is maybe every quarter they just in faith host a coffee night, and they invite anyone who's interested in missions to come to this coffee night and just talk to missionaries. Former missionaries, current missionaries that happen to be on home assignment, and the pastor. And they just have an open space to dialogue about it. I think when you set up an event like that regularly, you are expecting God to call people, and you are having faith that he's going to call people up in your congregation. It's also not a bad thing to tap people on the shoulder and say, hey, like, I know your skills as a dentist would really be needed in this Middle Eastern community that we're connected to. Have you ever prayed about this? Can I pray with you about this for the next month and just see what God does? It's not necessarily pressuring, I think it's just opening up a dialogue and expecting God to call people. So I think that's another way you can do that. Shayna asked, what was the team.org link? Jessica posted it in the comments, but it's team.org/churches is where you can find all that. Yeah, what other questions do you guys have? I've seen another way, just as you kind of start engaging in missions, is if you maybe want to take a vision trip to a ministry area, take a few key leaders of your church to a place where you think God might be calling you guys to go more in depth and serve there. So we are working with a church right now who is taking a short-term trip to just discern if God's calling them to this area. And as part of their trip, they asked specifically, what sort of long-term workers are you looking for? What characteristics and what skill sets do you need? So once they got a list of that, they began tapping people on the shoulder of like, hey, I don't know if you feel called to missions. We know you have these traits. We know you love the Lord and have a heart for sharing the gospel. So we would love for someone with your skills to join this short-term trip. So that's a little easier ask than, hey, do you want to move around the world for the next few decades? So yeah, that's a great place. What if you're not a pastor? How do you get your church leaders on board? That is maybe probably number 2 question we get. Number 1 is how do you care for missionaries well? But number 2 is how do you get your pastor on board? I would say as church engagement managers, we spend a lot of our time working with volunteers and missions committees, because a lot of times it starts with someone that just has the care and has the time to think 100 or not 100% of their time, but a good chunk of their time at church about missions. And we've seen churches changed because of that. I think the big thing we've seen is once maybe a missions committee plans a mission trip or a short-term vision trip, After people come back from that trip, a lot of times the pastor just sees the difference in engagement with the church and engagement with reaching people locally once they've seen what it's like to reach people globally. So I would say keep going. All you volunteers that are on here, first of all, thank you for spending a little bit of your morning with us, especially as a volunteer. And I know sometimes it can be frustrating because you want everyone to care as much as you do. Please know you're not alone. We're praying with you. We're here to stand by you and encourage you in that. The other thing I would say is that if your pastor is at all able to take a vision trip or visit your missionaries overseas, it just changes everything when you can see that and see the work. Some of our missionaries have said whenever I say, how's your church loved you and cared for you? If their church has come to visit them, that's the number one thing they say. They say, yeah, my pastor came and visited and it changed everything. So if you can get the pastor to travel, that's always a good thing. How can Team help my church engage in missions if we usually send through our denomination? That's great. Yes, so I'm a Southern Baptist girl myself. So I am no stranger. I love the IMB and love what God can do through the churches. I think what Team offers is just a little bit different, a little more of a one-to-one approach as far as for you and your church and your missionary, we're able to just specify maybe a little differently than a denominational place. Again, it's not a good or bad thing. They're all needed, and we celebrate working together to fulfill the Great Commission. But yeah, we work with a lot of churches who maybe traditionally send through a denomination. All of our resources are available for free, and our church engagement managers would love to work with you, whether you plan to send through a denominational agency or through Team. Our goal is to see more people sent. So whatever that looks like, we would like to work with you on that. What does it look like for the agency and church to work together? Great question. I think it's asking hard questions of each other. My favorite thing is whenever a church calls in and has hard questions for us about a budget or about member care or about a specific instance, because I think when a church is asking hard questions, it means they care. It means their missionary is going to benefit from that. I think it's wise to probably know exactly who at the agency you would be working with or talking with, like having a contact at the agency. So a lot of times churches maybe might narrow down the amount of agencies they work with. Maybe they've got, 3 to 5, and they know those 3 to 5 contacts and they know exactly who to call. I think that really helps with that relationship instead of having, 25 agencies that you have to know how they all work. Having about 3 to 5, or, if your church is larger, maybe that number is bigger. I think for Team, what that looks like is sending a lot of resources. So whenever it's Christmas time, a sending church might receive from us, here are 10 ways to love your missionary during the holidays. Or whenever they're going on home assignment from the agency, you can expect to receive, here's what your missionary is going through, and here are some ways that you can serve them, and here's how Team's serving them. So yeah, you can expect resources from Team kind of through every life cycle stage of the missionary. But yeah, conversation, that's the biggest thing, communication. Doug says he highly recommends taking a small group from your church to the mission field. It's a game changer. Yeah, totally agree. Even for me and my work, my first year with Team, I got to visit our ministry areas, or several ministry areas, and it just changes. It changes how I do my job, and it changes how I see church engagement. That's actually why I got into church engagement, is because I met so many missionaries who just wanted to have a closer relationship with their churches. And I was like, how can we do this? So that's why I joined church engagement to begin with, was because of visiting the field. What are some effective ways you've seen ordinary church members get involved in the communications aspect? I would say ordinary church members is the main way that this happens. So taking prayer requests that you receive in newsletters and sharing them in your small group, sharing them in your Sunday school class. If you've got a rotation of people who pray up front, sharing those prayer requests from the stage, if you're, a lay person who's going up there to do that. Yeah, I would say that's the big thing. I think working through the groups that your church has, so a lot of churches either have Sunday school classes or small groups, having like an advocate in each one of those groups or each ministry that's kind of reminding like, hey, this is what's going on around the world. Here's what we can pray for. And so the more people that are doing that, the more lay people that are doing that, the more communication is going to spread throughout the church. We've got a resource on our website that is how to create a missionary care plan. And one way of doing that is finding a point person for each main ministry of your church who's going to ring that bell for missions. So from children and preschool all the way up to senior adults, from women's ministry to transportation ministry. What does it look like to have someone there ringing the bell for missions? I think the more lay people involved, the more it really becomes a part of the church, not just something that's said from stage. What are the trends that team is seeing with the younger generations of missionaries going to the field? How should churches adapt their sending process for these generations wanting to go to the field? This is exciting. It is a very exciting time for missions because I feel like we've got a lot of creativity across organizations of people wanting to go and wanting to go in unique ways. One way we see that is through people wanting to take their jobs overseas. That's definitely not a new thing. Of course, we see Paul doing that in the New Testament. But yeah, we see more people now saying, there are different ways to go than maybe just the traditional funded missionary model. Although here at Team, we send people with the traditional model, we send kingdom professionals and everything in between. But I think that's one thing we've seen is people that are more interested in taking their gifts and skills in the marketplace and going overseas. The other thing is we really want to go with a platform more times than not. So really having a reason when people say, why are you here? Really being able to say, oh, this is exactly the work that I'm doing in this country and why I'm here. I think we see that a lot with millennials and Gen Z. Another thing we see is shorter commitments. And so the mindset that any missionary that goes overseas is a success if they go through to retirement. I don't know if that's necessarily true anymore. I think that can be debated by a lot of different people that are smarter than me. But we see a lot of people that are wanting to make commitments of maybe 2 years or maybe 4 years. And I think learning to define success as a church, as what is a successful missionary, is it someone that stays through to retirement? Or is it someone that went for 2 years, dedicated their heart, and comes back with a bigger heart for the nations here in their home context? So that's the big thing. I think defining success is important. And I think that's a church decision, is what does that look like for your church and how will you celebrate what God's doing in that way? How should churches adapt to their sending processes? Again, I think that has to do with the church values. And that's something the church can decide individually. But maybe the biggest way we see that is kingdom professionals or people that are going with their jobs overseas oftentimes don't have the 2 or 3 year lead time that other missionaries have. And so training has to happen a lot faster. And so we're kind of seeing some organizations really help with that. Upstream Collective has a helipad training is what they call it. So instead of having the runway of a plane, you can go up with a helicopter. Yeah, and we're learning as an organization here at Team, how do we adapt our processes to serve that well. On people going short term, how can we engage those people in our mission strategy so they get even more people on board with missions? Yes, that's great. So short-term trips are a part of your mission strategy. They don't have to be some extra thing. So whenever you're thinking about sending short-term trips, I would think, how do you send them to the missionaries that you've already sent or to the same ministry areas? How do you invite the missionary to come back to your church, maybe doing a short-term trip to teach you how to reach the people of the same context? So we've got some missionaries that serve in a Muslim context overseas. And so they'll take a week each year to help lead a local mission trip for their congregation on how to reach the Muslims next door, which I think is really awesome. So yeah, I think you can always adapt that into your long-term missions vision. Short-termers can help and give your missionaries extra help. If you don't have any missionaries that you've sent from your church or that you're currently supporting, that's where Team can come in. We can help connect you with some missionaries that maybe are from your area or fit kind of the same personality and calling of your church, and we can get you connected so your short-term trips can start to be along a longer-term strategy. After they return, yeah, that's good too. I mean, they're huge advocates. I think the first priority when a short-termer returns is debriefing them and helping them adjust back to life as normal. I know when I went on my first trip, I was a wreck after I got back, and I really needed my church to surround me and help help lead me in what does it look like. I just had my world rocked, and my view of Christianity was so expanded beyond what I had before that. So I really needed the church to come around me and help me apply that. What does that look like now that I'm here? At the time I was a student. As a student in the United States, what did that mean for me? So after that debriefing and care aspect, I think you can move towards them being an advocate. They can share what they saw, and they can share updates from the missionary. Maybe they are able to lead a short-term trip next time, or do some sort of training for your next short-term team. I think there's a lot of ways to utilize them. Just giving them a voice in whatever way fits with them. One way, I think it's great to have short-termers share, with on Sunday morning or Sunday evening, whatever that looks like to you, or with small groups of just what they saw. And I think it doesn't have to look one way. So maybe you've got a short-termer that's not a preacher. Instead of having them get up there and preach, maybe you can do a Q&A, or maybe you can do a video segment or something like that, whatever fits their gifts and skills. I think we've got enough time for maybe 2 or 3 more questions. We got a few questions about adopting missionaries that are freelancers or missionaries from other countries. We'd love to talk to you if that's something you're interested in. You can go to team.org and you can contact a missions coach, and they will be in touch with you about what that could look like and if that's possible for you. I want to say I'm really encouraged. Just thank you for spending some time this morning with us. I know we've got pastors, we've got missions leaders, we've got people that are just interested who are on the call. I just want to say you're making a difference. By just ringing the bell of missions at your church, you are making a difference for the nations. And, it can be overwhelming to think through the 4 steps. Like, how do I get my church to be praying and discipling and preparing and communicating all in 1 year? That can be overwhelming. I've been there. I like to do things fast. I like to get them done. But the reality is a change in a church is going to come through, first of all, the Holy Spirit. And God cares about this more than we ever will as individuals, as we will as an agency even. God's the one who's going to lead the charge. The second thing I would say is maybe pick one of those things to see further engagement in this year. So maybe it's prayer, or maybe it's discipleship. Maybe you want to create some strategies, or maybe you just want to have some rhythms of communication. Maybe pick one to start with so it doesn't feel quite as overwhelming. And then the third thing I would say is you're not alone. Church engagement has people across the US and Canada. And then even if you're in another country, we might have some missionaries that are interested in talking to you about this as well. We would love to work with your church to find specifically what God is calling your church to do, and what it looks like for your church to engage in missionaries, in missions. It's not one size fits all. Of course, the biblical principles fit all of us, which is awesome. But the unique steps that we take to get there, we can help you with that. So you can email churches@team.org, or we also have a contact form on our website that I think Jessica will probably put in here. We'd love to talk to you and just coach you through and pray with you. Great. Yes, Jessica already put that on there. Excellent. Well, I'm so encouraged, guys. Thank you so much for spending your time with us this morning. Jessica, is there anything else we need to do before we close out here? I'm going to take that as a no. If you got more questions, email churches@team.org or fill out that contact form. Thank you, guys. I hope you have a great rest of your day, and I'm praying for all of your churches as they engage in missions this year. Bye.